We're back, and I'm in excited anticipation about what our question today's gonna be. So, what do you got, Jules?
Ooh, this one is one that I've come across just in my daily life, in my work life, and what I do. And I was going for a walk the other day and I was jumping around with a couple different questions, and I actually prepped some notes on a different question. And then on my long ride home from vacation with my fiance, this one popped in. I was like, nope, this is it. And I completely switched. So the question is, why do a group of smart people make dumb decisions?
Hmm, I'm just writing it down. Um, yeah, is it? And something like there's a crack in my thinking opening up around. Wasn't there a movie or something about this that talked about like this, this genius group and like why do they repeatedly make these stupid mistakes? Um, right off the cuff, there's there's something I noticed that happens when specialization, like genius specialization, is involved in a conversation, and some of that is in the excitement and pursuit around ideas that haven't even had a chance to be vetted whatsoever, and so it can be easy to be really convincing. Intelligence plays a big part in that. That there's this thing to go do, and then there isn't the moment where that opportunity can be challenged in any way, or that any sort of considerations about side effects on that idea are considered at all. And you even see it, in some of the fear of AI is kind of like we've got a lot of smart people working on this, but on what basis, with what principles, and what attention to the potential external side effects of something like this. And so that's one part of it. The other part of it is sort of the danger of groupthink, where it's easy to head into a direction because there's a bias in similar thinking that then leads us down we'll say a rocky road, if you will, as well, that sort of favors sort of that kind of behavior. But that's just sort of what comes off the cuff for me. What about that question excited you, and what have you?
Yeah, I think what excited me about that question is this problem hides in plain sight for most of us in ways that might not be very obvious. But when we take a step back, we realize, oh, I'm conforming. I knew what the right move was, or I felt in my gut that what the group was deciding was not the right path or the right answer or whatever it might be. And yet I still went along with it. And I think most of us face this all the time, but it happens below our conscious awareness, especially in organizations, in teams, in sports. It happens everywhere all the time. And so I think why it excited me so much is because it's everywhere, it's ubiquitous. But most of us just don't recognize it and continue along that path of conforming and giving in to the consensus of the group, even though something in our gut is telling us, I don't think that's right. And I think a lot of us have really lost the like that inner knowing, or being able to hear the inner knowing. We all have that inner knowing. We all have that gut feeling. It really never leaves us. But I think a lot of us have lost connection with it and have lost the ability to hear it over all of the other noise that is constantly swirling around us. So I think that's why it excited me so much, because it's a super common thing that happens, and yet it's rarely addressed. And it can be on like a grand level, like if we think back to the pandemic and herd mentality and group think around the pandemic, you were on one side or you were on the other. um, So it can happen on like a grand scale like that. And even then, sometimes we don't recognize what's happening to us. And then it also can happen on like a very small scale, like going out to dinner with a group of friends and everyone's suggesting this one restaurant, but you know that the last 3 times you were there, your shrimp was undercooked and one of your friends got food poisoning, but you're afraid to speak up about it. So you just go along with it. Like it can happen on that level too. So
Yeah.
I think that's why it fascinated me.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, one of the things, and part of sort of the generative listening practice is understanding that listening is our ability to receive information in all forms, not just what we hear, but to pay attention to. And one of the things that the practice really encourages is retraining your sensitivity to sensations, feelings, and thoughts. And much like our own, we'll say, I don't know if our stunting or dulling of our senses that has us human beings, modern human beings, based on many factors, we can't even discern whether we're hungry or thirsty. And
Mm-hmm.
often we're thirsty, but because the sense is so dull, we think we're hungry, and so we end up over consuming. That we've actually detuned our attention to, or it gets cataloged into the woo-woo side of things, or when we're experiencing like let's say a sensation, we tend to not have words to articulate what we're experiencing in a way that matches the rigorousness of intellectual discourse. And so, you know, I would say the United States favors some of this. Like we love rational based thinking. We love, answer based, evidence based, well articulated, those kinds of things. And so I think we have a bias to being persuaded by the analytical view of the story, but our guts are saying something else, and we're not listening, or we're afraid to speak to it, or we don't know how to language what we're experiencing. This occurred actually. I was conducting a workshop in Dallas, and we did an exercise, and you sort of did a body scan about, okay, well, what's your brain saying to you right now? Put your hand on your heart. What do you notice? Any feelings, any sensations? Put your hand on your belly. What's your gut telling you, right? And a woman in the room was like, "Oh my gosh, it has been so long since I've actually listened to my intuition, which I believe is centered for many reasons right here in your belly." And in that moment, recognize a series of bad decisions that analytically sounded just right, though her gut was saying otherwise, and she didn't act on it. So it was like this reminder. She's like, "Whoa, what happened to my ability to listen my intuition, that deeper wisdom subconsciously?" But it shows up as a sensation that we often ignore.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I was going to ask you for an example, and that is a perfect example. And I think a lot of people can relate to that. Um, the regions of the brain that are involved here that I kind of want to touch on a little bit are the anterior insula, which helps us with our own interoception, helping us to process bodily needs. So understanding, is our heart racing a little bit? Are our palms getting sweaty? Are we feeling a little bit anxious? And then what do we do about it? And then the other part of the brain that's kind of involved here with helping us figure out, okay, what needs our attention and what needs our priority is the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex. And together, those two regions really help us with this gut feeling, helping us to determine, okay, well, what needs our attention right now? I think the problem is that oftentimes we're surrounded by so much noise and so much swirl that we're not able to fully tap into those signals and give it the space it needs to speak loudly. I kind of think of it like, and one of the ways I explain it to people is like a snow globe. When you shake that snow globe, you can't see anything because all of that snow is swirling around, um, and it's chaos. Like you cannot notice the details of the scene that is always sitting there. But when you stop shaking and you let that settle, you didn't create anything new. You didn't suddenly have this beautiful image of a, you know, um, Swedish town in the middle of your snow globe. It was always there. You just created the calm and the space and the silence that allowed you to see the details of the scene. And that's kind of the same thing that happens with us and with those two brain regions, the insula and the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex. They're always flagging to us. They're always telling us, okay, this needs our attention, this doesn't, this is what's going on in our body. But when there's constant swirl and noise and stimulation and external input and people's opinions and our own thoughts of what will they think of me, or what if I say something wrong, we can't hear it. We can't hear that inner gut. And that's why meditation is so incredibly powerful. And I think we've touched on this theme in every single episode, the power of silence and creating space. It always comes back to that, I feel like, because it's in that space and in that silence where creativity has room to play, where we are able to tap into that intuition that is always there, that gut feeling. But a lot of us are afraid of the silence, because when we are silent, our own internal thoughts start to surface, and some of them can be really scary. And a lot of us are afraid of that because, one, we're not familiar with silence. Think about it. How many people cannot wait in line without pulling out their phone to start scrolling social media? Or how many people cannot drive 30 minutes to work without turning on the radio or a podcast? Like, we have completely removed boredom, silence, and stillness out of our daily lives. And I think that's a real problem. And I think that's part of the reason why we struggle to not only hear our gut and hear our intuition, but then to act on it.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. And what you're speaking to so much reflects we aren't giving ourselves time to even process.
Yes.
And all of us, each of us, I believe, process things very differently. From, one extreme is I need to take this all in and sit with it overnight. I need to have a eureka moment around this thing. What I find happens a lot, especially when the ideation's going on, is okay, maybe a problem was stated or a vision was stated, but as soon as we start to get really excited about an idea, we'll lose relationship with the context of why is it we're doing this in the first place. And so I call it activity addiction, right? Ooh, shiny thing, we can go build it. Let's go do that. And then we myopically run toward that thing without constantly asking the question or reminding ourselves, ultimately, why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? And as we try things, is it actually serving its original purpose or not? We just get seduced into the excitement of, because human beings are really great. You charge away and you head off and start doing something, and then all of a sudden realize that was a giant mistake. But we just get lost in the sort of the seduction of the excitement. Something else that I think we aren't paying attention to is what also either gets lost or even doesn't get discussed is, okay, what's the underlying framework behind what we're going to go do? Like, what's the boundary or sort of ethical pillars or whatever that would lead us to, as we march down this path, to keep those things in mind, right? Like, do no harm. Well, there's a thing that if we kept in mind, right, to what degree in attempting this could it cause harm where there wasn't harm before, right? And so oftentimes, like when we're like helping an organization in the endeavor of innovation or whatever it may be, the first thing we do is get really clear on those things. The context story. What's the reason we're doing this in service to what? What does ultimately success look like? What are the principles we won't violate as we approach this thing? And then that becomes the leading narrative through what happens, right? And so it always is a place to say, okay, let's start here. Let's hear what everyone's doing. Now let's go back. Do we notice any violations here? Do we notice that we're off the map or whatever it may be? I like to call it as a sort of the dossier that follows. It's the narrative that follows the work. And we tend to, in the pursuit of the work, lose sight of the narrative. I see this happen. I work a lot with architecture firms, and I see so much time wasted because somebody lost sight of the narrative. Mm-hmm. And then we end up in a situation where we have to relitigate the narrative, or the project goes sideways, often ending in legal action because something got missed in the original narrative that was carrying that project through.
There's so much there, and that's so interesting. This is also why I loved this question for you, because you have so much experience working with such a wide range of organizations. And I think this, impacts this question of why do a group of smart people make dumb decisions impacts so many organizations. And I was wondering why, from your perspective, that is. And I think you just stated it beautifully with they lose sight of the narrative that created the first step, the momentum in the first place. And then they get fixated on this new, exciting, shiny thing, which, again, is exactly how our brain is designed to work. Our brain is designed to seek novelty, to get that hit of dopamine, especially the way that we've trained our brains in modern life with all of this cheap dopamine and constant stimulation. We are literally training our brains to scan the environment, to widen our surveillance, and to constantly look for the next new, novel, shiny thing. And it makes total sense because organizations are made up of people. People have brains that have trained the next new, novel thing. And it's very easy to get sucked into that and to completely lose sight of the context and the narrative. And I think, in the spirit of this entire thing that we're doing with these episodes in this podcast is the power of asking questions. Why are we doing this? Why do we start this? What was our narrative? What is the foundation? What is the context? And then constantly having to engineer that into the culture of the company itself, so that we're constantly returning back to that, so that we don't get sucked into that shiny thing, knowing that that is what our brain is designed to do and what we've trained it to do. And I just think when we provide that foundation of going back to the narrative and asking questions, what are we missing here? Is there a different way that we could do this? What are people's guts saying? And welcoming those questions rather than seeing them as just pure criticism or negativity, but welcoming the curiosity is what you see in the most successful, innovative, creative organizations and companies. They're the ones that ask people to question the norm. But it can be scary, and it can make leaders feel like they're not capable or that they're letting people down or whatever it might be. And so it is hard for leaders to, encourage that in the culture. But if you think about what a culture really is, it is a group of people that are making predictions based on what they've already experienced. So if they have experienced something where, somebody asks a question or challenges the status quo and they get a slap on the wrist for it, now everyone's going to make the prediction of,
it'll happen again.
Questions I can't challenge because I'm going to get in trouble for it. That is what culture is. It's a series of predictions that the people making up the company are making about what they have experienced or witnessed or observed in the past.
Well, that's, going back to something we've talked about before, but, the culture, we'll say, gives rise to behavior, but culture is coming from how have people experienced this place, from both, what's it like when I challenge something. The other is how do I get done what I need to get done, and how do I game the system to do those things. I'm curious, from your perspective. I also see ego gets into this one big time, which is we get so excited and we get the ego hits about, wow, isn't that such a brilliant idea? And so we recklessly pursue these things driven by ego and the feedback we get and the pats on the back, whatever, that can lead us into terrible directions pretty quickly. Curious about, ego and its part in this.
Yeah. Ego is a very interesting one. The ego is something that can absolutely hinder organizations and really, really hold you back. When the ego takes over making decisions, it is often driven by somebody who feels powerful and who wants to keep that power. We get hits of dopamine when people say, oh, great idea, or yeah, when we get that external praise, we're getting hits and hits of dopamine, and it feeds the ego and it makes it grow. And kind of then what happens next is that ego then causes that person in a leadership or powerful position to act as if, they know everything. And if it wasn't their idea, it's not a good idea. And they shut down creativity, and they create a culture and an environment where people don't feel safe. Their nervous systems are picking up on this energy where they're constantly having to scan for threats, to wonder, is this the right thing to say? Is this the wrong thing to say? And so ultimately, what a big ego does is it creates an environment that feels unsafe for everybody else living in it. And when that happens, you get the group think, the conformity, the herd mentality, because those other people are so afraid of challenging. And the brain, when faced with two disparate ideas or conflicting energies, will always err on the side of safety, which in this case would be conformity. So, somebody might be struggling in a new environment with a new company where the leader has this big ego and they have not cultivated an environment that encourages questioning. The people don't feel safe, and somebody is feeling two things. Number one, I think that is the wrong path to go. I see errors and I see a lot of reasons why this isn't going to work, and it's going to make things a lot more difficult down the line. And then the other thing that is conflicting to that is, but if I speak up, I'm going to be reprimanded and I'm going to get a slap on the wrist. So what do? I have these two conflicting ideas. And when a nervous system does not feel safe, when it feels threatened, it will always err on the side of safety. And so what do? They stay quiet and they agree with the person that has, established the way that we're going to think no matter what. And so I think that's kind of the role that the ego plays. It starts slow and then it grows very quickly, all based on external feedback and dopamine that feeds this feeling of power. And then ultimately the domino effect is it creates an environment where people don't feel safe to speak up, and therefore they conform to whatever that person in power is saying.
Yeah. So I heard this the other day on a event I was at, and gosh, I'm gonna fail on the attribution for it, but I'll try to clean it up in the notes. That consensus is a form of violence.
Mm.
Because typically how we get to consensus, this thing we hold in such high regard, is through bludgeoning our way there by, stammering or hammering out the voices that may be contrary to the thing, or suppressing anything against the thing to get to consensus. And especially in any organizational system that has a hierarchical dynamic present, those with higher ranks in the hierarchy have more influence, whether they know it or not, whether they say, hey, take my title off the table. It's still there, still present, right? And so those things tend to, I find, get in the way. And so what I find has been really, really useful is detaching the idea that's my opinion man, like cult of personality framework that we typically use, to actually generate a framework to objectively make calls against.
Mm-hmm.
And so an objective framework would be, okay, here's the intention of what we're about to go do. These are the outcomes we're looking for. And then these are the elements of the alignment that we need to have as we proceed. And that elements of alignment. So alignment, I find, is a thing people talk a lot about, but very little understand what it's for. I like to think of alignment as a means to traverse certain terrain. And what we need to do is understand the terrain we're traversing and then figure out what is the alignment that favors going over that terrain. So, for example, a road-going car, its number one criteria in the way the wheels are aligned is safety. Now, there's a cost and efficiency for doing so. because there's more tire wear, there's other things to maintain an alignment that favors safety, such as you slam on the brakes, the car continues to go straight. Now that's really important, right? And so that being the non-negotiable on top, you can have other things you're looking for. Okay, with safety addressed, no violations around safety, then what are the other benefits we could favor? In a car, like, okay, it's a performance car, great, safety first. Now, how would we set the alignment to favor performance versus fuel efficiency? These kinds of things. And that work, when you do it, it gives you an objective framework in language sitting in front of you to say, hey, let's test this against what we said, as opposed to creating what we normally do in an environment. We don't do that. And then it's like you show up with, I just disagree with this. And the rest of us are like, oh, there's Jules doing Jules again, being a stick in the mud, right? And, crapping on our ideas. No, we're looking at this thing and we're saying, does it hold up against the criteria in which we all were committed to? And do we need to alter the criteria based on what we've learned? Now we have a reference point and a framework to guide us through the process. And, Johnson & Johnson is very famous for, in their origin story, sort of creating they've got their declaration that's been with them since the very start. And there were two instances, one where they violated it, talcum powder, two where they honored it and pulled Tylenol off the shelves, right? So in one of those cases, likely they forgot that thing and introduced something into the market they knew could be harmful, and it was. On the other, just the mere idea that there was tampering within Tylenol, they risked, all revenue, because their biggest product, to yank them off the shelves just in case. So I like that example because it's sort of, when we live by those things, we're making more thoughtful choices. When we forget about those things, we lose sight. And like, for example, my wife's in the food quality and safety industry. And we talk often about how is it that we have a food industry that allows for dangerous foods being served. And I find that fascinating, like Taco Bell's famous example, where the actual beef quantity in their meat was so low, the FDA said you can't call it meat anymore, which was 53%. So think about this, like, to be called meat, it has to be at least 53%, animal product. Theirs was under that, right? And so obviously there was an efficiency profit story behind it, but they let the profit win in the face of this other thing. And oftentimes maybe things that go on there to say those, getting more profit out of the way we produce things doesn't have to be at odds with also producing something that, we would be proud and would call it, nutritious or whatever it would be. It doesn't have to be a binary. So maybe this brings me to a point. Binary thinking gets us into a lot of trouble. There's a right and a wrong way to do this. There's A or B. Mm-hmm. Binaries, I think, are so limiting, so misleading, that there's the idea being there's any possibility across a field of constraints, which is a much more, I find, robust way to think through these things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's so much there. And my brain explodes every time I hear you talk and give all of these examples in the best way. And essentially, like, what I'm getting from what you just said is we don't necessarily need to get rid of groupthink or collaborating on a thought. What we need to do is take that effort and take that energy and just transition it to something that actually fosters curiosity and creativity. So instead of just one person having an idea and everybody else being afraid to speak up, so they just go along with it, foster groupthink around asking questions, around bringing us back to the narrative and to the context. Because groupthink and herd mentality, we're always going to default back to it. It's wired into our brains for so many reasons. I mean, the brain is built for belonging, and social rejection feels like a direct threat to our safety. So although we no longer live in those hunter-gatherer times where we were living in tribes and we had to survive in a group, our brain is still wired that way. And so we always come back to that group think and to that herd mentality and what is going to help me belong, what is going to keep me safe, what is going to help me survive. And so just instead of trying to label that as bad or negative, or, oh, you're a group thinker, you're just part of the herd, we're trying to take that power, take that wiring, take that DNA that we have, and just shift it to something that's a little bit more productive, which I think, to your point, and what I just heard from you, is ask questions, create a culture of curiosity, and praise that, and use the power of the ability to think as a group and just shift it into, okay, well, now as a group, we are questioning, what do we need for alignment? What is most important to us? What is our why? Why did we start this? And what is the context and the foundation that we're building on? So I think what I want to make sure people understand from this conversation is, we're not saying groupthink is evil and herd mentality is evil. It's very innate. It's very natural. It's the way our brains are wired. Just be conscious of how it is manifesting in your life, and take that power and then intentionally shift it to something that is more productive, that fosters, curiosity, growth, and creativity.
So here's something, and I'm deploying this at a big event soon, which is the concept of what we don't normally do, which is let's get our thinking story straight before we act.
Mm.
So the way I like to put it is, let's say you've got a piece of the thinking, I've got a piece of the thinking, and it's different than yours. I may have some of yours, but I have all of mine, and you may have some of mine, or whatever. And so and so over there's got some thinking, and then there's this whole gap in the thinking that's all filled up with assumptions. And we never actually expose, hey, before we go act, let's get clear on the thinking story we're going to use to inform our actions. What's your part of the story? What part of the story is unclear for you? Here's my part of it. And so the idea being, like, could we create and complete the thinking story? And then the thinking story becomes the framework in which aligns thinking, but does it in a way that we've actually been thoughtful about it. Now, this does two things. One is it benefits everyone, because now this thing we call common knowledge is actually shared. We talk about, oh, shouldn't it be common knowledge? I'm like, well, the common knowledge we never communicate. So how could it possibly be common? Like, you have a bunch of common knowledge and so do I, and they may be completely different from each other, right? And neither are right or wrong. They just are. So it completes the thinking story. And in that being in language gives us the third party reference point, which keeps us from being in the echo chamber of agreeability and gives us a third thing to create a more circular conversation revisit. And it favors recursions and revisiting those things. And it strips ego out of it, and fear out of it, because it's no longer my opinion, man. It's because here's what we said. And so that's something I encourage a lot in organizations, is listen for the thinking, expose the thinking, and get the thinking story as complete as you can, then move forward. And the thinking story is always going to change because you're learning new things, but that thinking story is the source. And so we never even talk about the thinking. We just go run off and do the thing.
That's interesting. I've never heard of that before, the thinking story. Can you give an example, or maybe talk through the process you took with a specific organization? I feel like I just need a little bit more to understand it.
Well, so let's just say, for example, well, this is one that comes up all the time. This came up recently in a workshop that I was doing. Someone was complaining about, well, shouldn't that be common knowledge? I can't believe they're behaving this way, right? Whatever it was. I'm like, tell me about what you think should be common. And then, of course, she laid out a bunch of things. I'm like, where's that all coming from? She's like, well, it's coming from my experience. Oh, now that I think about it, that's things I grew up with. I'm like, well, what generation are you? I'm like, okay, well, that was common knowledge for you. Have you ever asked them what they're thinking with what their common knowledge is? And in doing so, found whoa, there's actually all this stuff that, because it was undiscussed, now that it's exposed, completed a more robust story that considered a broader audience in this case, right? Multi-generational audience, instead of a myopic view of, well, I grew up with this as common knowledge. Well, that's your generation, right? There's another set of common knowledge here, as an example of that. But also, and I see this a lot, is we, over time, we build so many reps of doing certain things that it becomes completely invisible. For an example, this was with a financial advisory firm that I was working with, and it was one of the founders was talking about they were doing some training, right? And it was kind of like, okay, well, there's one form of training, and then there's a completely different form of training which has to do with thinking. One form of training is, okay, we have a young advisor here, and they should know the standard operating procedure around checking box A or checking box B. And here's how you know which box to check. Great. Well, that works when what shows up like makes that clear. But we live in a place of abstraction, and there's always a variable. Because the thinking story didn't get talked about, the minute something that didn't look familiar showed up, they stopped. The system stopped. Didn't know what box to check. Because what didn't get transferred was, here's all the years of experience that has it obvious for me, check box A versus check box B. Now, when I transfer that knowledge, now the other has gifted with the ability to think about and make decisions around things that don't match, a familiar pattern. Changed everything as it related to how quickly they were able to develop their team to be autonomously able to make their own decisions thoughtfully and intelligently, because they had been gifted with the thinking that the founders took for granted because they've been doing it for so damn long.
Got it. Brilliant. Yes. There's so much there. And I know I say that every time you talk. I'm like, oh my gosh, there's so much there, because there's so many things I want to touch on. But that was such a good example. And I think essentially what you're doing with this thinking story, and the most important thing you said is sharing the thinking story, is that from a neuroscience perspective, everything we experience, everything that, the predictions that we create of reality, because I've said this before in one of our episodes, but I need people to understand that reality does not happen to you. You are actively creating and interpreting and predicting your own reality based on two things: your remembered past, which in the example you gave is coming from people's past experiences in organizations, past failures, fears, traumas, successes, people's childhood, how they were brought up, the generation that they grew up in, et cetera, et cetera. So that is part one, your remembered past. And then part two is your sensory present. What am I experiencing now? What do I hear? What do I see? What do I smell? What do I taste? What do I touch? Those two things combined is what creates your reality. So if somebody keeps their thinking story to themselves, of course, the person sitting next to them is not going to be able to see that reality, because it's based on a completely past experience that they didn't have exposure to. And so when you have the ability to consciously and intentionally share that thinking story, you are essentially hacking that part of reality. You're giving them insight into your past, into your experiences, and you're opening up their ability to predict and possibly experience a completely different reality. So when you align that thinking story, you're literally giving them a tunnel into your thought process, and then vice versa, and then thus the reality and the possibilities of the future. So that is kind of what I got from everything you just said. And it makes total sense from a neuroscience perspective of, we have to give the brain evidence of something to be able to see something in the future. And when you are just keeping that thinking story to yourself and not sharing it, you're literally blocking somebody else's ability to see the reality that you are currently experiencing.
I'm just letting that all settle in. I want. So there's something. So I'm gonna back up and then share an example of something. I'm curious about your take on it. Um, I think that it's really troubling when we think about things as truths,
Yes.
right? And the way, and I'll say that in a couple of ways. One is like to understand that we're interpreting everything anyway. Even if you go back, like we know, even in past experience, our brains do not remember accurately at all, right? And we know this through court case after court case and all of this stuff. We distort everything. And even on the quantum level, we literally can't directly interact with any of this stuff anyway. We've got delays in our neurology, that all of this stuff going on, that everything's an abstraction. And so one of the things I encourage, when I'm doing development, I can get into some heady stuff, is to say, what if there's no truth? What if there's only interpretation? The question then becomes, is it relevant or not based on the circumstances or the context of what it is that we're talking about? I mean, like the boiling temperature of water. One would say, for the vast majority of the world, it's, a particular degree until you change elevation. And then that temperature changes dramatically. But we hold it as, and it's even in cookbooks, right? Boom, that's the temperature. I'm like, go up 5,000 feet, different temperature. Go on to a different planet, different. So it's an interpretation based on the context or environment or situation. And so if we treat things that way, then it frees us to challenge things we hold as true. Now, here's the example. And I love this story, and it has to do with my long-term involvement in the manufacturing industry, which was the truth was efficiency is the only design constraint of the supply chain. An entire industry was born to create an efficient supply chain. And as global manufacturing increased, then the supply chain that enabled it all, efficiency was the truth. That was the thing that we're after no matter what. And no one called it into question. And what happened after the pandemic? The entire supply chain globally fell apart because no one ever said, is efficiency above all else the best design constraint? Because efficient things are wildly fragile. They serve a single purpose, and the minute a variable gets introduced, the system falls apart. That's the nature of efficient things, right? They do a thing with the least amount of parts and energy needed, but as soon as a variable gets tossed at it, it doesn't function. And we experienced that, and I don't think we've talked about it enough nationally, that that was chasing for 40 years efficiency as the single truth of the design of the supply chain. Effectiveness actually competes with efficiency. Something to be effective, right, means that likely it's less efficient than it could be, but it's much more resilient to change. And we've, of course, learned the hard way that, single sourcing a primary element to one politically unstable country is probably not a good idea, but boy, it was efficient. So it blinded us to make really bad decisions that we paid a huge price for. I mean, it shut down the automotive industry, it shut down all of these industries overnight. And we had to figure things out and still are. So going back to that concept, let me connect the dots here, is if we hold things as all interpretations, I believe it frees us to challenge and say, wait a minute, is efficiency the truth or an interpretation that is a factor in its design? Are there other things we should be considering? Again, to protect us from, gosh, I don't want to challenge the truth because I'll be seen as a heretic. Versus if we hold them all as interpretations, is this the most relevant and valid interpretation that we're operating with right now? Let's call it into question.
Yes, I think that is a brilliant reframe. Framing something as an interpretation, like you said, creates space and creates this natural funnel of curiosity, allowing you to question things. Where again, as you said, with truth, it's like it is what it is. It's black and white. And again, we go to the binary thing and the danger with binary. It's true or it's false. No, it's a spectrum. And if we label it, and then again, back to the power of language as interpretation, you automatically switch the environment and the energy around that thing. And back to the concept of efficiency versus effectiveness, I think that was such a brilliant example with the automotive industry, because not only do we operate that operate at that level on organizational level or industry level, but also on the very human level and on the cell level. Everything about our brain is about efficiency, really keeping us safe and being efficient. we have these neural pathways that we have repeated over and over and over again so much that they become automatic, and we don't even have to consciously think about them. I mean, think about every time you drive to work and you don't even remember the turns to get there because you've done it so many times that you've deeply ingrained that pathway, and you can literally do it on autopilot without thinking about it. Or like, I think back, this is kind of a silly example, but my family is from Puerto Rico on my dad's side, and we're from hillbillies up in the mountains, farmers, land workers. And on Friday nights, all of the workers would go out to the bars and get drunk. And because their horses have taken that route so many times, the horses know how to get home. They don't need the driver. And that's kind of, it's a silly example, but that's kind of like how our brains work. And the
Such a
problem with
great story. I love it. Like, I'm like, how is this gonna get? Wow, that was awesome.
yeah, I know. I was like, I hope this lands full circle. But yeah, the horses know the way home because they've done it so many times. They don't need the direction of their rider to get there. And so that's kind of how we operate all the time. But to your point, efficiency is extremely delicate. And we see that with our brain. So when we get something wrong, or when something happens and our brain says, okay, well, we've experienced that before, and we've experienced this before, and we've experienced this before. There's three factors in a situation. Our brain says, we expect this to happen because based on our neural pathways, based on the repetitions we've had in the past, based on our past experiences and our sensory present, this is what we expect to happen. This is the most likely outcome. That our brain gets it wrong a lot of the time. And when it doesn't happen, our brain says, whoa, what's going on? And a lot of the time that can signal fear to the nervous system. That can signal uncertainty, unsafety. And a lot of the times, if we don't know how to regulate ourselves, if we don't have that ability to be cognitively flexible and to be adaptable, a lot of us start to feel anxious. We feel worried. We're like, what's going on? How do I deal with this situation? Everything's against me. And that's when like a lot of these anxiety issues pop up, or the feeling of being stuck, like knowing there's so much to do, but you can't take that first step because it's just completely overwhelming. That speaks to the fragility of the efficient brain. It's the inability to be able to adapt on the fly when the context switches or when there's a bump in the road. And so to your point of, coming full circle with efficiency is truth, when we shift it to efficiency is an interpretation, we are opening up the possibility of so many other avenues. And then on the brain and cellular level, that is a brain that is neuroplastic, that has the ability to take that prediction error. And instead of freaking out, somebody has the ability to regulate their nervous system and say, okay, well, that's not what I thought was going to happen, but that is one interpretation. That is one possibility. There's so many other ways that I can tackle this problem or find a new solution. And then the power of that is that prediction error, and then the ability to overcome it is a direct signal to our brain to stimulate neuroplasticity, which is the brain's ability to update, adapt, rewire, physically change, form new connections, and to overcome those old pathways that were keeping us stuck. So
I read somewhere that like in what you're describing, our brains actually increase in size.
yes,
That's incredible.
gray matter increases. So people think that like memories or learning, people think that it's just like things stored in our brain like a filing cabinet, but that's not how it works. Memories and learning consolidation and the ability to be cognitively flexible and adaptable, it's a network of connections. And when we create more networks of connections, we actually see the gray matter in the brain increase. Like our brain actually physically changes. And the reverse is also true. There's so many fascinating studies coming out right now, and I'm probably geeking out about this because, well, one, I'm a huge nerd, and number two, because I have a baby girl on the way. But the danger of screens for kids it literally reduces their brain's capacity to grow. We see less gray matter, less connections in brains with kids that get over 7 hours of screen time per day. So the brain is adaptable in both ways. The brain is absolutely adaptable to overcome prediction error, but then and physically change and grow. But then it's also going to shrink if we don't give it the right stimulus. And I talk about this a lot when it comes to, you know, training a better memory or to whatever it might be, or helping to reduce your risk of dementia. We have to provide the proper stimulus. We have to provide challenge, novelty. And again, one of the ways to do that full circle is by, in simple day life, is not accepting truth as truth and not questioning it, but allowing interpretation. Because when we create the space and the curiosity to allow interpretation, we're traveling down all these other neural pathways that, you know, are going to start sparking and forming new connections. But if we think only one way, or we believe only one thing, we're traveling that same path, and it's an opportunity cost. We're not allowing ourselves to explore all of those other neural connections that support brain growth.
There's oh my gosh. I know, like we can keep going. We need to wrap up. It's like so two things. I want to be clear on efficiency versus effectiveness. It's not one over the other, they're choices. Efficiency comes with a side effect of fragileness. Effectiveness comes with a side effect of expensive.
Yeah.
And we need both, and we need to make thoughtful choices on, okay, what would benefit from efficiency knowing it becomes more fragile? What right now would benefit from effectiveness that may become efficient in the future, is how I challenge people to be thinking about those things. Like we're trying something brand new. It's wildly expensive. Both our thinking about it, what it takes to make the thing actually work, right? But we got to see, will it work? And then from there, take it into a place of, okay, well, what can we strip out of it that would allow it to do it more efficiently, so on and so forth. The other thing is this conversation has brought me to an interesting conclusion that I'm curious about. Everything it feels like we've talked about today and likely in previous conversations to counter some of the stuff are techniques we can use to simply create space where we can make choices instead of going into our automatic, right? This idea of like, okay, well, let's abstract the criteria from people's personalities so that we have an objective. Simply gives us a place to pause, open up that space from our automatic reaction to thoughtful consideration and thoughtful response. That's what I'm hearing in so much of what we're sharing today. Are you picking up on that too?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of our episodes have come back to that. And I think the hardest part about that is being aware of the moments where you need to intentionally create that pause in that space. Because we are just so surrounded by noise and stimulation and external opinion. And what if they think I'm weird? Or what if I'm labeled as not productive or lazy? Whatever it is. But yes, I mean, that is the ultimate superpower, in my opinion, is the ability to be able to pause, to take a step back, to not constantly be looking for external input or influence or external answers. And creating that space, the silence. Again, we go back to the snow globe, or even you can think of it as stirring a glass of water with sediment in it. The more you stir, the darker it becomes, the more cloudy, but let it sit, let it settle. Now everything becomes clear. It's the same concept. So yes, absolutely. When we can learn how to do that intentionally in the right moments without labeling ourselves and without caring what other people think, we are tapping into our own innate power. The struggle is, how do we do it?
How do we do it? Yeah. Yeah. So much more to say here, but why don't we wrap it here? Thank you. Like, it's so much fun to play around with these things. I feel like even what we're doing in a way is sort of bringing a a part of that thinking story together that doesn't normally get put together as it relates to what we're doing. And it's just, yeah, there's so much. I don't know what to say. I'm just like every time we do this, I'm like, this is so awesome.
I agree. It truly gives me life and like fills up my cup because I think what we're doing here, like in every single episode, what we are doing is exactly what we talk about during the episode of there is no truth and there is no false. There is interpretation, there is curiosity. And so it's like kind of on this meta level, like we're talking about those concepts and we're explaining why it's important. But then that's what we're doing in these episodes with these questions is we're not finding one answer to the questions. We're simply exploring them and asking more questions about the question and then going from there, which I think is just brilliant on so many levels.
So just a word to the audience, give us feedback. Like, what do you make of all this? Throw comments on YouTube, and you'll find us now also on Substack in written form. And I encourage you to also just like ask questions you think we should be talking about. Let's start that process too. So until next time, Jules, thank you.
Thank you so much.